So the most worrying trend of all is really this knock-on implication to genuine people and people's lives. We see the biggest economic damage typically from floods and winds right across Europe and here in Ireland. But when it comes to actually mortality rates, it's the extreme heat that is the big killer. And that's the main trend we're seeing with very clear evidence, this increased trend towards heat. So definitely it's very worrying.
It's great to be back with another Environment Edge podcast, and you're very welcome to the show. With rain of almost biblical proportions for the last 8 months, farmers have been really struggling to get the work done.
The big question is, why has this occurred, and will it continue to happen into the future? Head of Climate Services Division with Met Eireann, Lambkin, joins us to discuss.
I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Glenn,
your Teagasc Sustainability Advisors. And you're welcome back for another Environment Edge podcast number 78. And here we go.
Keith, you're extremely welcome back to the show again. The 2023 European State of the Climate Report, it's just been released. Keith, could you just elaborate on some of the findings?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and it's quite a significant report as well, this one. So for the first time, we have two big heavyweights. We have the World Meteorological Organization. So they're a branch of the United Nations which govern weather and climate worldwide, which Met Eireann and all other Met services will be a part of. They've teamed up with Copernicus Climate Services. Copernicus are effectively the Earth monitoring arm of the European space program. So an awful lot of resources in there as well. They keep a very close eye through satellites as well as observations around the country from the likes of Met Eireann weather stations and our many volunteers. And these two heavyweights together for the first time have combined to produce an annual look at Europe, in this case, Europe 2023. So it really is a very high-level, definitive look at what happened in 2023. And I guess it may be no surprise, we knew it was warm and wet out there, but the actual numbers that are coming in down from this analysis is that Europe was actually one of the top 2 warmest years on record ever recorded. So going back to kind of 1850 odd, we're going back quite a while here. So it really, really was very, very hot. Globally, of course, it was the warmest year on record. And Europe kind of tracked that signal then as well. Interesting fact as well. So the report tells us that Europe is actually the fastest warming continent on the planet. It's actually currently warming at twice the regular speed as the rest of the planet. So that was worrying information as well.
And is there any reason behind that, Keith?
Yeah, there's a few factors involved in that. The Arctic itself is warming incredibly fast. Okay, we've seen an awful lot of melt and an awful lot of increased heat there. The Arctic actually is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. And because of Europe's proximity to the Arctic, it's experiencing a lot of that heating effect as well. So that'll be one of the factors that's dramatically helping to increase the heat around Europe. Second one is Europe's position in the world. So Europe is next to the Atlantic, and in our part of the world, we see a lot of the winds coming from the west. So as the planet heats up and as the sea heats up, we get a lot of warm moisture over the Atlantic. And the westerly winds bring that warm air across Europe. So it's adding almost like an extra heater effect across Europe, adds that additional heat as well. So that's another factor that plays a part. And the third real driver of this increased heat, and this is a bit of a strange one, almost ironic to a certain extent, is that Europe have been particularly good with clean air policies. We've been particularly good at tidying up pollution in and around Europe. Now, there are tiny particles in pollution that are extremely good at reflecting the sun's energy back out into space. So these tiny particles, sulfur dioxides and others, have what we call a very high albedo. They're really good at reflecting the sun's energy. Now, by cleaning up a lot of these pollutants for genuine, legitimate health reasons, we're actually letting more of the sun's energy land and come onto Europe as well. So it's really kind of a combination of these three things: the proximity to the Arctic, geographical position and those warm winds coming in from the Atlantic, as well as the clean air policies allowing more sunlight to reach the Earth. They're all kind of combining together to make Europe the fastest warming continent on the planet.
A few years ago, the talk was all about the ozone layer, wasn't it? And now we're not talking about that as much.
Completely, yeah. So, I mean, going back probably 20 odd years ago, I mean, it's rare to read an environmental article without hearing about the ozone layer and the dangers that ozone presented. And they are very real dangers. But if in any way, the ozone conversation, I find is almost a classic example of how we can actually work together to solve a
Mm,
global environmental catastrophe. I mean, the
mm,
ozone story, if you cast your minds back to it, in the 1970s, through measurements, scientists discovered that there was a depletion in the ozone. It became known as the ozone hole. And by analysis and science, they managed to convince the politicians to put in place uh, policies, what was called at the time the Montreal Protocol. It was an international treaty. And this international treaty then effectively caused the ban of CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons, or the reduction of them. And it was through that global initiative then what we started to see through Met Eireann measurements and elsewhere around Europe and the world, we started to see the whole decreasing, stopping, leveling off, and now we're beginning to see it recover again. And we're expecting a full recovery later on towards the end of the century.
that's good news.
And it's actually a very, very similar journey that we're on from a climate change perspective as well, because in a similar template, through measurements, scientists discovered that the planet was heating. And through analysis and science, they realized the cause of that was the additional greenhouse gases. And through international policy and protocol, we had the Paris Accord, which is basically trying to reduce the additional carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And we're on that last tail of the journey now. It's through all this action that we're constantly hearing about, reducing emissions. It's that action step can lead to improving the climate change. So we've kind of already proved through the ozone story that the world is capable of preventing global environmental disaster. Now we're on that journey in a similar path in climate change.
Pete, something you said really interested me there a second ago, that so we're almost being punished by Mother Earth for keeping our European air cleaner because of the reduced reflectiveness from the sun. Is there potential for technologies to be developed where we could put something into the atmosphere to do the same thing, but obviously cleaner air?
There's a number of geoengineering solutions that are trying to look at other ways of kind of stopping the warming or reducing the warming of the earth. From a similar perspective, one of those theories is kind of almost spraying sea salt higher up into the earth. Clouds themselves, clouds need these kind of tiny particles in order to condense around. They're called cloud condensing nuclides. So you need these tiny specks of dust in the atmosphere in order to get clouds in the first place. And the potential idea, clouds, just like pollutants, are fairly good at reflecting the sun's energy back out into space. So if you could create more clouds by spraying extra particles, ideally natural particles, into the atmosphere, you could potentially get more clouds to reflect more of the sun's energy. There's also a counter argument to that if you start messing with Mother Nature, you may create a whole load of unintended consequences on the back of that. And a lot of these theories aren't fully proven on the larger scale yet either. So there's potential there, and there's certainly people looking at these, but it was still a long way away from seeing any of these actually practically implemented in any kind of scalable way.
Yeah, we're even seeing stuff on social media about cloud seeding and Dubai, and if things go wrong, it goes really wrong as regards too much rain.
Yeah, I guess Mother Nature take home point is incredibly complicated. And if you tweak a part of it accidentally or otherwise, it does have knock-on consequences, as we're seeing with the additional greenhouse gases to the atmosphere.
Yeah. So we're wetter, we're warmer in Europe. It looks like you mentioned three things that's going to make Europe warm up even more, and obviously we're right smack bang in the middle of where the westerly winds and all that heat is coming up towards us. In Ireland, is it worrying for the trends for us in the future where we're located? And I suppose what you've discovered, I suppose, in the three things you just mentioned, is that built into the models now for the future, or was it in the models previously?
So the models themselves are constantly evolving. And there isn't just one model. There are many, many models. And a lot of these models are developed in different ways, using different physics and even different data sources with different assumptions. So one of the things we try to do in Met Eireann and elsewhere is actually combine all these different models together. And that gives you a much better idea of what the models are saying rather than put all your eggs in one particular model basket. And it's no secret, the further on you advance, the more advanced the models get. So the models we're using today are infinitely better than the models we used 20 years ago, which were better again than the earlier models. And we particularly see this now as these IPCC reports come out. They typically come out, give or take, every 7 years or so. And the level and accuracy of the models that they use in each of the iterative reports is a step change each time. So the more we know about the atmosphere, the more they're assimilated into the models. From a trend point of view, I guess what the models are showing us is that we're still seeing a strong trend both in the observations, but also in the models of increased warming. Okay, so that's kind of loud and clear. And if you look at any kind of graphic or record, whether it's Ireland, Europe, or the world, you can clearly see that warming trend. So that warming trend is worrying because it has knock-on consequences to other parts of the atmosphere, disrupts the water cycle, and so on and so forth. But also can have an awful lot of actual genuine health impacts that go along with the physical climate itself. The European report we were just talking about specifically looked at mortality rates in Europe in 2023. And we know we're seeing more, hence a more extreme weather events. So in 2023 alone around Europe, we saw 63 people lose their lives due to extreme storms, 44 lose their lives flood, another 44 due to wildfire. Now, the numbers aren't in yet, but for heat waves, those numbers are expected to be in the order of tens of thousands of people to lose their lives on the back of 2023 heat wave and heat stress related events. So the most worrying trend of all is really this knock-on implication to genuine people and people's lives. We see the biggest economic damage typically from floods and winds right across Europe and here in Ireland. But when it comes to actually mortality rates, it's the extreme heat that is the big killer. And that's the main trend we're seeing with very clear evidence, this increased trend towards heat. So definitely it's very worrying.
We're working with the farming sector here in Ireland, and 2023 had one of the warmest years on record, and also one of the wettest. So what caused this, and do you think, or what are the predictors? Is it going to continue to happen into the future?
Yeah, 2023 and even into 2024 really has been remarkable here in Ireland. So 2023, as you said, Deirdre, it was the warmest year Ireland had ever experienced. And it was quite bizarre how the year played out as well. I mean, a normal year, you have kind of seasons. It's wetter in the winter, it's colder, it's warmer in the summer, and it's drier. You might have good summers and bad summers, and that's all part of nature. But this year we saw record June temperatures. So we've never had a month of June warmer than we had in 2023. Okay, now that was unusual in itself. But then the following month, to July, it was the wettest July ever recorded. So there you have two extremes literally back to back in the farming calendar. You have the hottest June on record, followed immediately by the wettest July on record. And then after July, August wetter than normal, September wetter than normal, October wetter than normal. November was just below normal rainfalls, but again, you're getting colder, so it's less drying. December wetter than normal. And then that rain continued into 2024 as well. So ever since that record July rainfall, it's never really let up, or at least up to this point here in early spring. So it really is causing a lot of difficulties out there. Where did this extra rain come from? Well, there's a degree of variability within rainfall anyway, as we well know here in Ireland, but we would certainly not be used to this prolonged period of rain. Now, one of the causes of this, we briefly touched off it, is the warming Atlantic. So during 2023, there was actually record marine heat waves out in the Atlantic. And during June, there was like literally the readings of temperature in the marine sector were off the scale. Scales literally had to be redrawing to capture the temperatures that we were seeing out into the Atlantic. Now, if you get really warm water, you know this from your kettle, water starts to evaporate, okay? And heats the air above it, and a warmer air can also carry more moisture. So during these kind of record June periods, we were getting a huge amount of additional moisture being added to the atmosphere in the Atlantic. And as we touched off, those winds that are blowing from the west is blowing all that very moist air across Europe. Now, that's one of the factors that contributed to the heavy rainfall, consistent rainfall we've got. If we look at those marine temperatures now, they haven't really come back down. They're still consistently warm. In fact, if you look at the temperatures of the North Atlantic at the moment, they're still in record-breaking territory right across the North Atlantic. So we still have a lot of that extra heat moisture up in the air, and it has the potential to fall down. So while that was a contributing factor to the prolonged rainfall that we see here in Ireland, there's still evidence that there's still quite a lot of moisture in the atmosphere and likely to be into this year as well. So while there will be, fingers crossed, respite periods and so forth as well, there's still likely to see enhanced rainfall throughout the course of the year, and we get a bit more of a balancing back on those temperatures. So again, we talked about Mother Nature being extremely complicated. If you change apart, in this case, the warming of the Atlantic, and there was reasons for that, partly to do with climate change, partly to do with natural effects, that has a knock-on consequence down to rainfall here in Ireland.
It's still very cold now as well. Like we've had a huge amount of rain, so the farmers have been under pressure from that point of view, trying to get crops in and that. And it's still very, very cold. I mean, I feel the cold anyway. I don't know about you, but it still feels very cold, doesn't it? For almost May.
There is, and this is kind of coming down to year on year. What we're seeing as a bigger trend, we're seeing that because of this gradual warming, we're seeing that spring is typically arriving earlier on average due to average warming. So we're beginning to see growth ordinarily happening that little bit earlier. I'm sure many of your listeners then will be able to appreciate that. They're seeing bud bursts and they're seeing kind of growth earlier in the season, which temperature obviously is a trigger towards growth. But any year to year, month to month, you'll still get that variability of the weather systems. These shorter kind of past weather systems are coming across. And certainly at the moment, we're experiencing some of that coldness as well. Indeed, frost conditions likely as well. So when we talk about warming, and I guess this is important, and a big reminder of this was big freeze we had back in 2010 as well. We're always talking about climate change and warming and how warm things get. We can't rule out the possibility of cold episodes as well. Now, what we see across Europe as well is that when you constantly get cold, you're prepared for the cold. So you may have your snow plows, or you may have your plans, or you may have your plastic or whatever else you have in place in order to protect yourself from the cold. But if you hardly ever get the cold, it's harder to justify a fleet of snow plows and people on rosters to drive them and so on and so forth. So what happens then is, okay, you get these massive cold events less and less, but potentially then when you do get them, they can cause an awful lot of trouble because you're just not used to them, or maybe you're not prepared for them. And it's something we have to keep in our minds as well. While we're constantly talking about warming, we still have to be prepared to deal with cold effects as well, because they haven't gone away. They've just reduced in frequency.
It's funny, we're talking about last year, 2023, being the warmest year on record. But if you ask any person or farmer, they won't associate it with heat. They'll associate it with wet. And actually thinking back, I don't even remember it being overly warm in my own head, but I know the average temperature. But it was like Noah's Ark there for the last, since last August. And we were talking about it before we came on air, but it's not an understatement to say that farmers were mentally in a very difficult position and trying to get their work done in the last couple of months. If you went to a farmer, 3 weeks ago, it was a very different place than it is today with the brief good weather. So by the sounds of what you're saying, Keith, is we're going to have to start getting our heads around getting in gear for being ready for this in more frequent kind of weather, that it might happen more often, this kind of system that we've had in the last 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say the envelope possibilities has increased. So everything you'd normally be used to, but then we have to look at these kind of extreme things now coming into play as well. We're talking about wet this year and extreme wet, record-breaking wet. But it wasn't too long ago we were talking about the droughts and the extreme heat of 2018 and all the problems that brought towards water availability and crop growth and so on and so forth.
And we
as well.
Still talk about 18. It's like a marker year. Yeah.
No, it is. It's absolutely a benchmark in a number of sectors, not just agriculture. But that's not a million miles away from the wet we're talking about now. And the two polar opposites of extremes, and they're all happening in the space of a few years. And everything in between, the bland years, are still possible as well. So I think it's very much important that we plan for a wider envelope of possibilities. Yeah. Now, again, if you're constantly getting drought, it's easier to plant the drought. Or if you're constantly getting wet, it's easier to plant the wet. But when it's mixed up and you get different extremes in different places, it's just that little bit more difficult to plan for. But we're starting to build a mindset here in Ireland and elsewhere around Europe in trying to put structures in place, better kind of prepare ourselves for that increased envelope of possibilities.
Would the Copernicus climate change service, would that be of any benefit for the farmers to look at, for the predictors going forward?
Yeah, the Copernicus Climate Service is absolutely excellent. It's a European-based service, but it actually monitors the world with a focus on Europe. And embedded in it, they have they work with a lot of partners. So partners including ECMWF, what's that mean? That's the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting. And that's the leading best weather predictor in the world. And Met Eireann, as well as other Met services, are heavily involved in supporting that. And what Met services would typically do is they would take this longer range, kind of 10 to 15 day forecasts from the likes of ECMWF, which Copernicus support as well. We take that in-house and we run finer models over the area of Ireland using that as kind of input, and we can get even greater accuracies and greater support. That's where your weather forecasts come from. So from your weather forecast point of view, the best place to get over the next number of days or weeks would be Met Eireann. That's fed from this European Weather Centre, which Met Eireann supplies as well. What Copernicus now do as well, they're also in the business of providing seasonal forecasts. Now, they don't generate those seasonal forecasts themselves. What they do is there are other centres of excellence around the world in UK, in America, in Japan, and elsewhere who create these seasonal forecasts. And what Copernicus do is they collate those all together into one place. So it's an excellent place to go get a look at what different models are saying from a seasonal forecast point of view. Now, the problem is they're quite difficult to read, and also they very often contradict each other, because seasonal forecasting in Europe in particular is extremely, extremely difficult. So what we do in Met Eireann is we have people who evaluate those forecasts from a technical point of view and actually then turn that into some written texts, how it relates to Ireland. And we provide that through our website, kind of monthly on our seasonal commentary. So a lot of that seasonal stuff is from the Copernicus climate change, but we just kind of translate that into more digestible Irish relevant things. Now, sometimes that will tell you that there's no real strong signal on how rainfall is going to change, or it might be warmer than average. And sometimes there's a nice, strong, clear signal that all the models suggest it's going to be much wetter than normal over the next number of months. And then you've got a bit more confidence in saying something like that.
So the farmers will be sticking with the Met Eireann site for the moment.
Well, in the sense that we work with all these international entities as well, and we digest it from an Irish context point of view. So it's more Irish relevant, if you like. But
fantastic, yeah.
Thankfully, under these open data rules from Europe and elsewhere, all this information is out there. It's freely available. So it's certainly worth looking at as well.
Yeah, it's a very interesting site. Yeah.
With all the changes going on with climate change and just some of the stuff that we spoke about today, is it getting more difficult to predict weather, just even short-term weather? Because look, it doesn't matter who you are. If you get the weather wrong, you'll be accused of not doing the thing right, and you know yourself. But it must be getting difficult with all the outliers there now.
Not really, ironically, and this kind of goes against almost the general thought. Often I see in documents weather is becoming more unpredictable, and scientifically that's not actually true. The weather models are actually increasing in skill, so you can actually measure the skill of the weather forecasts, and over time, year on year, they get better and better. Now, it takes a long time to get better and better globally, and typically, as a general rule of thumb, every 10 years you get better by the day. So what you're saying happened 3 days time from now, in 10 years time, you can kind of say that with the same accuracy for 4 days time from now. So there's a clear improving trend in the weather models. I guess something that gets lost in translation is this wider envelope of possibilities is definitely there. And also we're seeing an awful lot more energetic weather, if you like. So sometimes we compare climate change to weather on steroids, in a sense.
We feel like storm chasers sometimes, don't we? We're watching them coming across the Atlantic heading up towards us.
Yeah, but additional heat can certainly add that extra energetic stuff. And that's particularly in convective systems, so kind of showery systems, you can get an awful lot of heavy downpours and showers. And one of the difficulties then as well with these heavy downpours is if a heavy downpour lands next to you, it can actually cause quite a lot of problems, a lot of localized flooding and so on and so forth. But if you have your weather app or otherwise type thing, it might just be picking a geolocated spot And on your favorite weather app, it might just kind of say that, well, it's going to be dry. But the actual forecast might be for showers. And if you were to look at the weather radar, you might clearly see those heavy showers coming across the country. But if your weather app said that it's going to be dry because it just picked a point that on its model was dry, and you get hit with one of these heavy showers, well, you'd rightly say that the weather forecast was completely wrong at that particular point. So it's more than just looking at the geolocation weather forecast. It's certainly mindful looking at the radar and looking at the actual weather forecast, the description of the weather forecast itself, because you can tell with a lot more confidence then if it's going to be a strong rain band come across the country. Everywhere is going to go wet. It's really a question of timing. But if it's going to be these strong convective showers, well, that's kind of a hit and miss. So be mindful of that as well.
Do you think that the mitigation measures and the adaptation measures that are everyone, society in general, farmers and society in general, are putting in place will reverse this extreme weather events that we're experiencing? Okay,
no,
that's bad news.
So,
Keith.
so but they're not intended to do that.
Okay,
so they're not trying to reverse climate change.
Okay,
they're trying to stop climate change.
Okay,
so I'd often use the analogy of the extra heat added to the system is a little bit like water dripping into a bathtub from a leaky tap. Okay, the more drops you add, the more water in the bath. So the more heat we add to the atmosphere, the more heat is being trapped in the atmosphere. Now, we have these great ambitions to be carbon neutral, net zero emissions by 2050. And there's all this global policy in place, European policy and national policy do this. And this is where we see all the mitigation targets and the adaptation plans. They're all focused towards reaching net zero by 2050. Now, what net zero by 2050 means, it means that we actually have now, we're still allowed to produce greenhouse gases, but we have to be able to absorb that same, if not more, of those greenhouse gases. We're not adding any extra. And if we can get to that point, we've now stopped adding additional heat to the atmosphere. We've effectively fixed the leaky tap. We have not drained the water. We are trapped into that climate system that we have at the time. So all these mitigations and actions plans aren't trying to get us back to where we were 100 years ago. They're trying to put the genie back in the bottle to a certain extent. They're trying to stop things running out of control and getting worse. But make no mistake about it, we're locked into the heating and these changing climates that we're already seeing. They're locked in. We're just trying to do all these drastic measures to try and stop it getting even worse.
Look, Keith, this is a hugely complex topic, and it's great to see that yourselves are working hard on it and I suppose bringing it back to us, breaking it down so we can kind of understand, I suppose, the role that we can play in contributing, and also the role we can play in trying to deal with what's coming down the line for us. And thanks a million for your time in the show. Really interesting, and look forward to chatting to you again.
Always a pleasure.
So there you have it. Tune in next time to hear more interesting chats and discussion.
Myself and Deirdre will be back in 2 weeks' time, but do give us a rate and review on Apple and Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening to the Environment Edge podcast.